Welcome back to Channel 193. Thank you very much for joining us again. We have two stories for you today. The two stories are coming from Mrs. Jessica Anderson from Greenback School. She is going to do two read alouds. The first one is on Paul Bunyan, and I really want to hear about Paul Bunyan because I was trying to remember what do I know about Paul Bunyan. So I want to hear what about the read aloud. So I'm going to listen, and then she's doing one also on Pico's Bill. So please stay tuned, listen to the read alouds. They are at a second grade level, but hey, anybody can listen to this to learn a little bit more. Like I said, I'm way older than in second grade, and I still want to learn about Paul Bunyan. I want to see what I did forget from being out of school for so long. So again, welcome to Channel 193. Please make sure that you share with your friends that we do have videos that we are sharing daily. If they do not have access to Channel 193, please let them know that we are posting. Mrs. Malone, our technology supervisor, is posting them on the district website so that anybody can have access. If you don't have access to Channel 193, you can go ahead and go to our district office to look at the videos. So again, thank you so much for joining us. I look forward to talking to you again. Have a great day. Bye.
Hi, boys and girls. Today I'm going to read you a story that is a tall tale about a character named Paul Bunyan. A tall tale is a fictional or made-up story that has a character that's larger than life or does things that ordinary humans cannot do. A tall tale also has a lot of exaggerations. Now, an exaggeration is where the truth is being stretched or embellished to make it a little more interesting. An example of an exaggeration you might have heard in real life would be someone say they're so hungry they could eat a horse. Now, they're really hungry and they want a meal, but they cannot really eat an entire horse. This is an example of an exaggeration. Now, our story about Paul Bunyan, which is a core knowledge story, has lots of exaggerations. So I want you to listen carefully to this story. As I read, I'm going to ask you some different questions to see if you can think about if this is an exaggeration or if it's not. You might also want to have a United States map available to kind of look at during this story because I'm going to be talking about different places in the United States that maybe Paul visited when he was a child or an adult. I hope you really enjoy the story of Paul Bunyan. Even as a baby, Paul Bunyan was mighty big. How big? Well, he was so big that his parents had to use a covered wagon for his cradle. Now, did Paul really sleep in a covered wagon as a baby? Or is that an exaggeration? As you might imagine, young Paul Bunyan had a big appetite. He gobbled up 5 barrels of porridge a day, and his parents had to milk 4 dozen cows every morning and evening just to keep his baby bottle filled. Now, do you think he really ate 5 barrels of porridge a day? Or that his parents milked 4 dozen cows to fill his baby bottle? Are those more examples of exaggerations? Paul was so big it caused some problems in the little town in Maine where he grew up. When he sneezed, he blew the birds from Maine to California. When he snored, the neighbors ran out of their houses hollering, "Earthquake! Earthquake!" After that, Paul's father thought it might be better if Paul didn't sleep in town. He built a cot on a large raft for Paul and floated it off the coast. Paul slept on the raft for a few nights, but the floating cot didn't work out. When Paul turned over in his sleep, he created gigantic waves that knocked down houses along the coast. Now, would parents really put their baby on a floating raft to sleep in the harbor? Is this another exaggeration? I think so. Eventually, Paul's father decided that the East Coast was just too small for Paul Bunyan. The only sensible thing to do was to move out west. So the Bunyan family moved to Minnesota. If Paul was too big for the East Coast, why do you think his father thought it would be better out west? Do you know why people were moving out west during this time? In those days, Minnesota was full of logging camps, sawmills, and lumberjacks. Now, a lumberjack is someone who cuts down trees. A sawmill is where the trees are turned into boards. And people use the wood from the trees to build houses and to make many other things. Americans were moving west and building the country. They had to cut down a lot of trees to make their homes, not to mention their schools, churches, boats, and furniture. When he grew up, Paul Bunyan went to work as a lumberjack, and what a lumberjack he proved to be. He made himself a giant axe with a handle carved out of a full-grown hickory tree. He could bring down a giant tree with a single swing of an axe. Now, could a man really make an axe with the top of a tree? Or chop down a giant tree with one swing of his axe? Are these exaggerations? As the tree tipped over, he would yell, "Timber!" So the other lumberjacks had time to get out of the way. Everyone looked up to Paul Bunyan, way up. The other lumberjacks were full of admiration for him. Now, admiration means that they thought very highly of him. The bosses were grateful for the amazing amount of work he would do in a single day. Paul had a big heart too, but one thing he always wished for was a true friend. There simply wasn't anyone else his size who could be his friend. That all changed during the winter of the Big Blue Snow. It was called the winter of the Big Blue Snow because it was so cold that everyone shivered and turned blue. Even the snow shivered and turned blue. Now, do you think the snow could really turn blue? Or is that an exaggeration? One day, as Paul made his way through the blue snowdrifts, he heard a muffled whisper. Now, if the whimper was muffled, could he hear it really well? He followed the noise until he saw two big blue furry things sticking out of the snow. He reached down and gave a pull. What do you think is going to be in the snow? It turned out that the two big blue furry things were two big blue ears. And connected to the big blue ears were a giant blue baby ox. Paul exclaimed, "The poor little fellow is half frozen." Paul carried the blue ox home, wrapped him in blankets, and fed him. The baby ox was so content that he took a long nap in Paul's big, strong arms. When he woke, he looked up at Paul, and do you know what he said? "Mama! Mama!" Then he gave Paul a big, slobbery lick on the face. Paul laughed and said, "Babe, we're going to be great friends." And they were. In fact, Paul Bunyan and Babe the blue ox were soon inseparable. That means they could not be separated. Everywhere Paul went, Babe went too. The two of them worked together in the lumber camps. Paul chopped down the trees. Then Babe hauled them to the river and chopped them so that they could float downstream to a sawmill. Now remember, in order for the settlers to farm new land, they sometimes had to prepare it for growing new crops and building homes. They often do this by clearing the land, all the trees away from the land. Together, Babe and Paul did the work of 100 men. Now, do you think they could really do the work of 100 men? Or is this another exaggeration? The lumber company figured the best way to keep Paul Bunyan happy was through his stomach. So they hired a special cook to feed Paul and Babe. Now, I want you to think, why would the lumber company want to keep Paul Bunyan happy? The cook's name was Sourdough Sam. Now, sourdough is a kind of bread. Sourdough Sam was known for the giant flapjacks he cooked in the world's largest frying pan. Now, flapjacks are another name for a pancake. The colossal pan sat on the enormous cast iron frame. Colossal means it was unbelievably large. Every morning, Sourdough Sam would build a raging forest fire underneath the pan. Then he would call for his two helpers, Lars Larson and Pete Peterson. Lars and Pete would grease up the pan by tying slabs of bacon to their feet and skating back and forth across the sizzling pan. Now, greasing a giant griddle with bacon on their feet and cooking over a forest fire sounds more like an exaggeration to me. Then, Sourdough Sam would make a giant stack of pancakes for Paul and an even larger stack for Babe. Thanks to Sourdough Sam and his overgrown flapjacks, Babe eventually grew to be even bigger than Paul. He was so big that if you were standing at his front legs, you would have to use a telescope to see all the way to his back legs. In fact, he was so heavy that his footprints filled up with water and turned into lakes. Now, Babe making lakes with his footprints sounds like an example of an exaggeration to me. In fact, there were more than 10,000 lakes in Minnesota today, and most of those were created by Babe the Blue Ox back in the frontier days. Babe and Paul helped the lumberjacks solve all sorts of problems. Once there was a river that was full of twists and turns. Sometimes the trees would get stuck in the turns and never make it downstream to the sawmill. But Paul Bunyan thought of a way to fix that. He went to one end of the river and sent Babe to the other end. Paul grabbed the river and pulled in one direction. Babe pulled the other end in the opposite direction. Then snap! Just like that, all of the kinks were pulled out, and the river was as straight as an axe handle. Paul and Babe straightening a river is another example of an exaggeration. Of course, this tightening operation left the river a good deal longer than it had been before, and there was a lot of extra water lying around. Paul and Babe worked together to dig 5 big holes to hold all of the extra water. Nowadays, these are called the Great Lakes. Did Paul Bunyan actually create the Great Lakes? This is definitely another exaggeration. One day, the logging bosses got to talking. One of them said that the United States was a fine country, to be sure, but it could stand a little improvement. For one thing, it could use a few more rivers. And what it really needed was a big river running right down the middle of the country, all the way from Minnesota down to New Orleans. If we had a river like that, the man said, we could ship timber down to New Orleans and all around the world. What river do you think they're talking about? Paul Bunyan happened to overhear this conversation. He told the bosses he would see what he could do. He hitched up Babe, and they started plowing south. As they plowed, they threw a great mound of dirt and rocks to the right and a smaller mound to the left. On the right side, they made the Rocky Mountains, and on the left side, they made the Appalachian Mountains. You can find both of these on a map of the United States. Paul Bunyan and Babe didn't stop until they had plowed a channel all the way south to the Gulf of Mexico. And the river that flows in that channel nowadays, that's what we call the Mississippi River. Now, the Mississippi River was a very important means of transportation in frontier days and still is today. From that day on, Paul and Babe went around the country, using their size and strength to help anyone who needed it. Later, they dug the Grand Canyon as they made their way to the west coast of California. Now, did Paul really make the Grand Canyon? This is another exaggeration. And when the wind blows just right from the west, you can still smell those infamous colossal pancakes cooking on the frontier. Now, do you think you can really smell those pancakes, or is that another exaggeration? I hope you enjoyed that story. The end. Think of all the exaggerations you heard about how big Paul Bunyan was, how big Babe the Blue Ox were. Think about what makes Paul Bunyan a legendary character. What makes him special? How is he larger than life? I want you to think about all the things in nature that they credited to Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox for making. I hope you enjoyed the story. Bye. Hi, boys and girls. Today I'm going to read you a tall tale about a character named Pecos Bill. A tall tale is a made-up or fictional story about a character that's larger than life. Usually tall tales have lots of exaggerations or where the truth is stretched and lots of things are make-believe. I hope you enjoy this story about Pecos Bill. As I read this story, I'm going to be asking you some questions. I want you to think about the answer to these questions when you hear them. Enjoy the story. The greatest cowboy that ever lived was the one they called Pecos Bill. Bill was born in East Texas and might have lived there forever. But one day his pa came running out of the house shouting to his ma, "Pack up everything we got, Ma! There's neighbors moving in near 50 miles away, and it's getting too crowded around here." So Bill's folks loaded a covered wagon with everything they owned and headed west. It was a long, hard journey. The children were packed in the back of the wagon, all 18 of them. They fussed and hollered and fought as the wagon bounced along. The children were so loud that Bill's ma said she couldn't hear the thunder over the noise. One day, the wagon hit a large rock and Bill fell right out. With all that fussing and fighting, nobody noticed. The wagon just kept going along. So Bill found himself sitting at the edge of a dirt along the banks of the Pecos River. Now this is a picture of the real Pecos River in Texas. And that's how he came to be named Pecos Bill. But that was later. So here's a map of the state of Texas where our story takes place. Little Bill was not your average baby. He didn't cry. He just crawled along on the dusty plain, keeping his eyes peeled for whatever came along. And the first thing to come along was a coyote. When the coyote saw this dirty, naked little creature crawling around on all fours, she thought he was a cute little animal, even if his ears were mighty small. Little Bill reached up and patted the coyote's head and said, "Nice doggy." Now, do you think these things really happened, or are they exaggerations? The doggy, Coyote, liked Little Bill. She took him home and raised him with her pups. Now, baby coyotes are called pups. What animal do you think coyotes are like? The coyotes taught Bill to roam the prairie and howl at the moon. They taught him the secrets of hunting, how to leap like an antelope, and to run like the wind. They taught him how to chase lizards and to lie so still that he was almost invisible. Now, do you think a young boy can really become a member of a coyote pack? Or is this an exaggeration? Now, this humorous detail makes Bill seem larger than life. And this is another exaggeration. The years went by, 18 of them to be exact, and Bill grew up strong and healthy. One day he was out hunting along the Pecos River when he saw a most unusual sight. It seemed to be a big animal with 4 legs. Or was it 6 legs? And why did it have one head in the front and another on top? What do you think Bill sees? Well, it turned out to be a horse with a man riding it, something Bill had never seen before. Bill scurried around the horse a few times, then he slowly crept forward and took a sniff of the man's boot. "Boy," said the man, "what are you doing scampering around down there in your birthday suit?" Do you know what it means if Bill was wearing his birthday suit? "Sniffing," said Bill. "I'm a coyote." "No, you ain't," said the man. "You're a man like me." "No, "Whoa!" howled Bill. "Coyote!" Why do you think Bill thinks he's a coyote? Do you think the cowboy believes him? "What makes you think you're a coyote?" said the man. "I have fleas," said Bill. "So what?" said the man. "Lots of men here in Texas have fleas." But Bill was not persuaded or convinced. He was sure that he was a coyote. "Here's the thing," said the man. "Coyotes have pointy ears and big, bushy tails. And you don't." "Yes, I do," cried Bill. He felt sure he had a tail, just like all the other coyotes. He looked over his shoulder, but couldn't see one. He reached back to grab his tail, but he could not feel one. He backed up to the river and looked for his tail in the reflection, but it was not there. Bill was surprised. He thought for a moment. Then he decided the man must be right. If he didn't have a tail, he couldn't be a coyote. If he wasn't a coyote, he must be a man. Bill decided he'd have to say farewell to his four-legged friends and try living as a man. He went to stay with the man who just so happened to be a cowboy. The man gave Bill some clothes to wear and a horse to ride. He also gave him a nickname, Pecos Bill. Now, why do you think the man called him Pecos Bill? At first, Bill had trouble living like a man. He couldn't stand the way his clothes scratched and pulled at his skin, or the way his boots came between his bare feet and the good old dirt. And he didn't see the need for a knife or fork when it was just as easy to use your fingers to pick up your meat and tear it with your teeth. Now, in the rest of the story, you'll hear him sometimes called Bill and sometimes Pecos Bill, but it's the same character. Bill learned to act like a man, but he still had a spark of wildness to him, and it would flash out from time to time. One day he was out riding on his horse when he was surprised by a mountain lion. The mountain lion scared Bill's horse away and charged right at Bill. But Pecos Bill was too quick for that mountain lion. He dodged the big cat, then hopped right onto his back. The mountain lion was not happy. No, sir. He bucked, he snarled, he tried to twist around and bite Bill. Bill held on to the lion's neck with one hand. With the other hand, he waved his cowboy hat in the air and shouted, "Yahoo!" The mountain lion did everything he could to shake Bill off, but it was no use. Finally, he gave in and let Bill ride him. Then Bill put a saddle on the lion and rode him like a horse. Bill had tamed the mountain lion. Another day, Pecos Bill was attacked by a giant rattlesnake. This particular rattlesnake was a mean old fellow who thought he was the king of the whole desert. He struck at Bill's heel, but Pecos Bill was too quick for that rattlesnake. Pecos Bill grabbed the rattler by the neck and squeezed him hard. The snake wriggled and withered in Bill's grip. "Say uncle if you've had enough," said Bill. "Uncle," said the snake, gurgling out the sounds as best he could. Bill relaxed his grip, or kind of loosened his hold a bit, and asked the rattler, "Who's the boss around here?" "I was," said the snake, "but now you are." "Well then," said Pecos Bill, "how'd you like to work for me?" "Sure thing," said the rattler. The rattler just looked at Pecos Bill with admiration and purred like a kitten. Pecos Bill had squeezed all of the meanness right out of the snake. Now, would you call this an amazing feat? Do you think Bill really squeezed all the poison out of the snake? Or is this another exaggeration? Next, Pecos Bill rolled the rattler up into a coil and rode away on his mountain lion. On the way back to camp, he spotted a runaway cow. He grabbed the rattler and tied a loop at one end of him to make a lasso. Now, a lasso is a rope tied in a circle to catch a cow. Then he rode after the cow, swinging his lasso above his head. When he was close enough, he tossed the looped end of the snake over the cow. Pecos Bill jumped off the mountain lion and pulled the lasso tight, stopping the runaway cow right in his tracks. Pecos Bill brought the cow back to his friend, the cowboy. After that, he taught all the cowboys at the ranch how to use a lasso to catch a runaway cow. Now, Bill had just invented catching cattle using ropes. Could a cowboy really rope a cow with a rattlesnake? Or is this another exaggeration? He taught them other things too. He taught them how to tame wild horses by riding them, just as he had done with a mountain lion. Now, tame means to train to obey people. He even taught them how to sing cowboy songs around a campfire at night, in a voice that sounded a lot like a lonesome coyote howling at the moon. Now, why do you suppose Bill's voice sounded like a coyote howling at the moon? Pecos Bill was famous for his riding skills. He once rode a wild Mustang called a backbreaker that no one else could ride. But that story pales in comparison to the time he rode something that no other man had before. And I reckon no one ever will again. A cyclone. Now, a cyclone is a real storm like a tornado. Do you think a man would be able to ride a cyclone? Or is this another exaggeration? That's right. Pecos Bill lassoed a cyclone with his rattlesnake lasso and jumped on its rip-roaring back. The cyclone spun furiously, trying to throw Bill off, and went spinning this way and that way across the desert of Arizona, trying to knock Bill off by rising up into the air and digging down into the ground. Pecos Bill didn't let go until the cyclone spun itself out of energy. Now, energy means the power to keep moving. And by that time, the two of them had carved out a deep canyon. If you ever go to Arizona, you can see that canyon today. It's called the Grand Canyon. Now, did Bill really build the Grand Canyon? Or is this another exaggeration? I hope you enjoyed our story today about Pecos Bill. I want you to think about all the exaggerations that this story has. Think about some things that Pecos Bill does that ordinary people cannot do. Bye.